All right, let's get right into it. Have you ever looked at the world and just wondered, why do huge groups of people seem to act in ways that are, well, completely against their own self-interest? It's a massive question. And today, we're diving deep into one of the most powerful and, pretty controversial ideas that tries to explain it: false consciousness.
I mean, really think about it. Why do people sometimes support policies that could make their own lives tougher, or accept social situations that seem stacked against them? This puzzle isn't new at all. In fact, social and political thinkers have been grappling with this for more than 100 years. So let's really unpack this.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll tackle the big definition. What is false consciousness, really? Then we'll get into the nuts and bolts. How is this ideology actually made? After that, we'll look at what it does, its function. We'll explore how you get from a state of false consciousness to what's called class consciousness. And finally, we'll wrap it all up by looking at this whole thing as a war of ideas.
So, what's the diagnosis here? To really understand this concept, we have to look at it from a specific viewpoint, what's known as historical materialism. Now, that sounds complicated, but the core idea is pretty simple. It suggests that a society's political and social structures are built on its economic foundation. And from that perspective, this phenomenon we're talking about, it's not some random mistake people make. It's not about individual screw-ups. It's seen as a built-in, predictable feature of any society that's divided into classes.
So what is false consciousness at its heart? Well, the definition is this. It's an ideological state where a subordinate class, let's call it the working class or the proletariat, unconsciously takes on the worldview, the values, the beliefs of the ruling class, the bourgeoisie. And this is the absolute key takeaway. This theory isn't saying people are dumb or easily fooled. No, not at all. It's about something way deeper. It's about unconsciously absorbing an entire system of thought that isn't really yours, and most of the time you don't even know it's happening.
But why call it false? That word can be tricky. Look, in this framework, it's not false because it's filled with a bunch of simple lies or incorrect facts. It's false because it presents a picture of the world that completely masks the real nature of the system, which, from this perspective, is exploitative. It makes capitalism seem natural, fair, maybe even the only way things can be, when the theory argues it's actually built on a fundamental conflict of interest. And the end result? It causes the working class to act in ways that actually prop up the very system that, works against them.
And this quote from Marx and Engels really nails it. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. Think about that. It's a bold statement. It's basically saying that whichever class controls the economy also controls the conversation. They control the dominant ideas floating around in a society. But that leads to a huge question, right? How does that actually work? How does one group's way of seeing the world become the common sense for practically everybody?
And that brings us to our next big point, which is absolutely crucial. See, according to this analysis, false consciousness isn't an accident. It doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. It's manufactured. You can almost think of society as having this giant social factory that's constantly churning out ideology.
So, what are the machines in this factory? Well, you'll recognize them. You've got the media, which sets the agenda and tells us what's normal. You've got the education system, teaching a certain version of history, a certain type of economics. The legal and political systems are huge. They treat things like private property not as a historical idea, but as a sacred, untouchable right. And of course, you have culture and religion, which can push ideas like individualism or the idea that your lot in life is just fate. All these things work together not just to promote the ruling class's worldview, but to make it seem like it's the only worldview, the universal truth.
And let's look at a concrete example of how this can work in practice, coming from our source material. In South Africa, one analysis points to how the clerical establishment has promoted an interpretation of Islam that encourages passivity and political quietism. The argument here is that this specific ideology serves a material purpose. It protects the interests of the Muslim bourgeoisie, the business class, by discouraging any kind of political challenge to the status quo.
And what kind of narratives does this social factory pump out? You've heard them a million times. Things like poverty is an individual failure, or that the boss is a heroic job creator. And the big one, the real knockout punch, there is no alternative to this system. These aren't just sayings, you see. They're powerful ideological narratives that make the current economic setup feel like it's as natural and unchangeable as gravity.
So, if this ideology is being actively made, then what's its purpose? What's its function? Well, according to this theory, its number one political job is to act as a shield. It's the primary defense for the capitalist system. And what is it defending against? The one thing that could truly challenge it: a united working class.
Think about it like this. From a purely materialist point of view, the objective interest of workers everywhere is to unite, to see their struggles as connected, internationally. But these fragmenting ideologies, they do the exact opposite. They slice and dice that potential unity. They get workers to focus on their differences, nationality, race, even what specific trade they're in, instead of their shared position in the economic system.
And the breakup of Yugoslavia is just a devastating historical example of this in action. You see, in the early 80s, you had a powerful, unified Yugoslav working class. They were organizing strikes, pushing back against austerity. They were a real force. So how did a leader like Slobodan Milošević respond? Not by addressing their economic demands. Instead, he and others unleashed this virulent, toxic Serbian nationalism. And the result was catastrophic. The class struggle was completely sidelined and twisted into a brutal civil war. It shattered that proletarian unity and ultimately opened the door for the restoration of capitalism. And nationalism is just one tool in the toolbox, right? You have racism and xenophobia, which are classic tactics for pitting local workers against immigrant workers, even though they have the same objective interests. There's also something called sectionalism or economicism. That's basically convincing workers to only fight for a better slice of the pie, like better wages, instead of asking why there's a pie and a wage system to begin with. The sources point to an even more cynical example of nationalism. Ba'athist regimes in Iraq and Syria would actually arm and support Kurdish groups in neighboring countries to cause trouble for their rivals, while at the very same time crushing Kurdish movements inside their own borders. It's all about division.
Okay, so this paints a pretty bleak picture, doesn't it? A powerful ideological system designed to keep people divided. Which leads to the million-dollar question. If this consciousness is so powerful and so pervasive, how in the world is it ever overcome? How does a population break that fever and move from false consciousness to what the theory calls class consciousness?
Well, the theory argues it's not some kind of slow, spontaneous awakening. It's a two-step process. Step one is when material reality just becomes impossible to ignore. Things like economic crises, austerity, war, deep poverty, they start to clash so violently with the official story that the ideology starts to crack. The propaganda just doesn't line up with what people are experiencing every single day. But, and this is a huge but, that's not enough on its own. The second, and what's considered the decisive step, is the intervention of a revolutionary party. A political organization that comes in with a scientific, Marxist analysis and says, here's what's really going on, and here's your historic role in changing it.
And this really highlights the critical difference between two types of consciousness. Left to its own devices, the working class might develop what's called reformist consciousness. We need a fair wage. We need better conditions. It's about getting a better deal inside the existing system. But class consciousness, the revolutionary idea that the whole wage system itself needs to be overthrown, that, this theory argues, has to be introduced from the outside. It has to be brought to the struggle by a political organization that's armed with that deeper scientific analysis.
All right, so let's synthesize all of this. Let's bring it all home. When you look at it this way, you realize we're not just talking about random opinions or beliefs. What we're actually describing is a deep, fundamental conflict, a battle between two completely opposing forms of consciousness. It's a war of ideas.
On one side, you have false consciousness. You can think of it as the primary ideological defense mechanism for capitalism. It's the software of class rule, running on the hardware of the state. Its job is to make the whole system look natural and legitimate, and most importantly, to keep the working class divided and disorganized. And on the other side of that war, you have class consciousness. And it's so much more than just waking up or being aware that things are unfair. In this framework, class consciousness is a scientific and revolutionary program. It's a tool for understanding history and a roadmap for action, with the ultimate goal of liberating humanity by completely transforming the system.
And so that leaves us with one final, really provocative question to consider. If one form of consciousness is the software designed to keep the system running, and the other is the program designed to replace it entirely, then could it be that this struggle, this war of ideas over how we see the world, is the central front of the entire class war? Thanks for joining me for this explainer.